Hi everyone, the Partial Prophet here. Thanks for tuning in. So I wanted to remind you that we know in part and we prophesy in part, and then when Jesus comes, he is going to help us see fully. So today I wanted to talk about the two Benjamins, or the three Benjamins, and the rabbi's predictions. Okay, so this was an article in the Jerusalem Post on September 24th. So let me read this to you. Okay, so the title is Netanyahu Gantz Impasse Predicted in Hidden Manuscript of Leading Mystic. Okay, so the article says in recent days, messages and articles have spread through social media claiming that this part got cut off, so I can't read it. The Kabbalist mystic Rabbi Yitzchak Kaduri predicted the political unrest surrounding the recent struggles by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and blue and white leader Benny Gantz in forming a government, according to Yisrael Hayom. Kabbalah is the Hebrew term that generally refers to Jewish mysticism. The prediction was reportedly found in a hidden book that was discovered in the Kabbalistic school of Nalat Yitzchak, entitled And He Swore to Isaac, written by Rabbi Kaduri in his youth and hidden by him. The excerpt that was circulated recently reads, On the eve of the year 5780, the upcoming Hebrew year, the year of corrections, there will not be a government in Israel for an extended period, and the various camps will be okay. So this is probably a translation from the Hebrew, so it doesn't really read really smoothly. So I'll try to make it a little smoother. And the various camps will quarrel much without a decision on either side. And then on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, they will fight in heaven, the holy side against the side of evil, and God and his entourage will decide between them. And this is all I can say, and from here I swore not to reveal more secrets and hidden things. The circulated claims state that in the Book of the Ancients, the covenant of the persimmon of the heavenly Kabbalist Rabbi Sasson Hai Shoshani, who is known as the prophet from Egypt, the following wonderful quote is brought that receives a special meaning in these days. There will come on the day that two ministers win the government in the land of Israel. Both their names will be Benjamin, and neither of them will succeed in establishing their government or kingship. On that day, know and understand that the King Messiah already stands at the doorway, and on the Sabbath afterwards he will come and be revealed. Understand this and remember it. The yeshiva religious school has all sorts of manuscripts by Rabbi Kaduri with the names of God and similar things that we are keeping in a safe, says Moshe N., an aide to Rabbi Yosef Kaduri, the current head of Nahalat Yitzchak and the grandson of Rabbi Yitzchak Kaduri. These are things that are passed from generation to generation in secret. In writings based on the teachings of Rabbi Sasson Hey Shoshoni, the redemption is discussed, and the writings also discuss that right before the coming of the Messiah, they won't be able to form a government. So what was published is very close to what was written in the manuscripts, but the published wording is not exact. Similar things were also written by Rabbi Kaduri's learning companion, Rabbi Mekanam Menashe, the author of Havavat Haim, who wrote in the name of Rabbi Shoshoni on the Parsha, weekly Torah reading of Ki Tavo, the Parsha that we read on the last Sabbath, about what will be in the end of days, how there will be a war with the rabble about the issue of the Sabbath, and how the rabble will be the majority. The things in the manuscripts of Rabbi Kaduri are similar, just that in his manuscripts it is written in more detail, and he talks specifically about this year as the year that could become the year of redemption. It's okay, so I didn't put in the rest of the article because this is what I put in here was what I thought was important. Okay, so I wanted to take what they said, their predictions, and look in the scriptures to see if there was kind of a basis for what they said, if scripture confirms these teachings. So one of the things that I thought would be helpful to look at was, do prophecies discuss an election? before the coming of the Messiah. So I took these verses from Luke, and so let me read these to you. Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. While they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Okay, so this isn't an election, it's a census that's happening in Luke. But I wanted to talk about it because it's kind of interesting. So it was a census of all the inhabited earth. It was kind of interesting that that's the wording that it talks about. It wasn't just a census of Rome. It was like all the earth. Kind of interesting. And then the meaning of census means to, okay, so here's the definition that I got. This might be from Strong's. To enter in a register or records, and then A, specifically to enter in public records the names of men, their property and income, or B, to enroll. You do kind of have a concept with the census is kind of similar to an election where you are entering in your vote. So there's that concept. But what I thought was interesting that it talked about everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. What's interesting to me about this is if you understand that Trump's presidency was a time of testing for God's people, and that God was using Trump to see where God's people would line up. There's a birth story of twins, and one of them is called, I forget what his name is, but it means a breach. And then the second one the second baby that was born was Zerah, and it means a dawning, a brightness. And so I think what we see in that birth story is there was first going to be someone that was born or anointed or put into power that was going to cause a breach, that was going to cause a division of people. And then the next birth that was going to happen was going to be one that brings brightness. And so obviously that's a picture of the Messiah. And so the breach, the division is, so what we've seen during the time of Trump is that obviously Obama's followers are even more strongly wanting to follow Obama, that Trump is causing so much hatred in their lives, and just making them even madder, so that they're just screaming for Obama to come back. And then what we also have is a group of people that are following President Trump like he's the Messiah. And he's very Messiah-like, and he's done things that seem like they're good for Israel on the surface. So you got to listen to some of my other videos to understand why they weren't really that good for Israel, what he did. And so, I mean, it was kind of interesting because, when he became president, he was 70 years, it was 777 came up in his, when he was elected. And so I think that God allowed these things to happen to test us. He wanted to make Trump look like a Messiah, to see if we would actually follow him and to see where our hearts really lie. But what we got to remember is that when the Messiah comes, we definitely want to be following Jesus, not President Trump. And so in the Gospels, we see the people that were following John the Baptist. When Jesus showed up, they switched and started following Jesus. And so we're going to see when the true Messiah shows up, people are gonna like recognize, Trump's not that good, and start following, Jesus, the true Messiah. Um, and remember that the stone that's cut out of the mountain is cut out without hands. And so there's a stone that's coming that's going to destroy all the previous kingdoms that was created by God. And that's the stone that was rejected. That would be Messiah. Okay. So that's that story. And so obviously we see in the story that so the census of all the inhabited earth, so that connects to, like I said, that God was causing a division in the world, um, through Trump, and to see where people would line up. And then because we definitely see the people, um that around the world, kind of the climate change people, they're all, kind of joining together, and, definitely, um, forming a group, or groups are definitely, coming together. So anyways, and so back to the story. And so we see after the census that then, um, Mary, who was engaged to Joseph, the time was completed for her to give birth. And so she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in cloths, laid him in manger. Okay, so that's that story about, kind of an election type happening before a birth. Okay, so then let's look in Daniel. And so I have the last couple verses of Daniel 5 and then the first 5 verses of Daniel 6. So this one's definitely a little closer to discussing an election. Okay, so let me read it to you. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps, I don't know if that's satraps or satraps, anyways, began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Okay, so in these stories, so what we see is, we see kind of the appointing of 120, of these satraps or whatever they are. And what's interesting is that if you understand Israel and the government in Israel, there's 120 people in the Knesset, and and so in an election, you have these 120 are appointed or are voted in, and or out of these 120, they vote for the different leaders. And so we definitely, the 120 is definitely connected to the Knesset in Israel. And then in this story, excuse me, we see okay, so I have the 3 events that kind of happen in this story. So we have the appointing of the 120, and the second one is there's a plan to appoint Daniel. And then that's followed by trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel. And so, so what we could see in world events is that we had an election in Israel on September 17th, 2019. Which didn't work. You know what I mean? That they don't have a leader yet. And then on September 19th, so I thought it was kind of interesting that the way it's worded in these scriptures is it said the king planned to appoint Daniel over the entire kingdom. And so there was a plan kind of to appoint him. It wasn't like it doesn't explicitly say he was appointed, it says there was a plan to appoint him. And so I thought what was interesting is that on September 19th, which is also Elul 19, that was the 70 years of Israel plus 70 weeks. It's a different way of looking at it. And then 70 hours would have happened on September 19th. So that's interesting to me because that would be like the 70 weeks that we see in Daniel. See, it's kind of interesting when you talk about 70 weeks because it's actually like a year and 18 weeks. But if you start counting from the 70th anniversary of Israel becoming a nation, which happened last year when President Trump set up his, when they set up the embassy in Jerusalem, that was the 70th year. And then this year is the 71st year, but counting 70 weeks from last year brings us to September 16th would be the 70 weeks. And then I calculated 70 more hours, which brought me to the 19th. And then what's interesting about this day too, it's also the 262nd day of the year. And so I thought that was interesting because it talks about Darius the Mede receiving the kingdom at about the age of 62. What was also interesting about this day was that Greenblatt went to Israel, to talk to the people in Israel about this peace plan of President Trump. And so then what's interesting about the elections in Israel is that exactly 1 week later, September 24th, that was when Pelosi called for impeachment of Donald Trump. So those three events, so these three things could kind of follow what happens in this prophecies in Daniel. So we have the appointing of the 120 is the first thing mentioned. And that's connected to the election in Israel. And then we have this plan to appoint Daniel to be, one of the three commissioners, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I could see like God like looking down going, okay, here's the leaders that I got out there. We got, Netanyahu, we got Gantz, we got all this infighting going on in Israel. We got Donald Trump who's kind of making a mess of things, so I could see that God would be saying, we need a better leader down there for God's people, and, I know that the Messiah, I know that Jesus possesses an extraordinary spirit. So I'm going, let's see God saying, I'm planning to appoint him over the entire kingdom instead of these fallen leaders. And so that was the second event. And, so what if on Elul 19, I see 19 connected a lot to the Messiah. And so what I thought about 19 and why it could be connected to the Messiah is if you look at the number 18, there's actually a lot of things with the number 19, that have connections to the Messiah. But one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is if you look at the number 18, you get 666 out of 18. If you add 6 plus 6 plus 6, that adds up to 18. And then so 19 would be the number that follows 18. And so if you understand that the Messiah is going to come after this time of 666, after the people have been marked with this 666, if you understand that, then you can understand why 19 would be symbolic of the Messiah coming, because it's going to follow this time of 666. And so then what's interesting too, okay, so then the third event is, Pelosi calling for impeachment of Donald Trump. So what's interesting is when you read about where they're trying, in this story where they're trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel, have we not seen throughout the presidency of Donald Trump that they have been trying to find a ground of accusation? They have been trying to get him impeached. They've been trying to get him kicked out of office. And for a very long time, it was the Russia collusion. And so, and that fell apart. And so, obviously they still want to find something. And so they were saying, they couldn't find anything, it's interesting that these verses say, but they could find no ground of accusation or corruption inasmuch as he was faithful. Well, Donald Trump did not have collusion with Russia. But what's interesting is that, the people just figured out that they could find an accusation with against him with regard to the law of his God. Well, so in these verses, like it says the law of his God is like capitalized. I mean, Daniel was obviously a very righteous person, but there's a shadow, a prophetic picture here. If this is a prophetic picture of Trump, it would be, instead of God, it would be like God with the capital G, it would be God with the small g. Because who is really President Trump's God? I would say it's himself, because he's very narcissistic like. And so what we were seeing in this phone call to the Ukraine is that he was talking about he wants to get reelected, and so that's what he was talking about. And and so he might have slipped up in that, because it's so important for him to get reelected, he was wanting to I don't know if it's really true that he was trying to get Biden out of the way for the elections, but it's possible. But either way, he said some things that, I mean, I don't think they're treasonous, obviously, but people are going to use it against him. So, and there's actually a verse in the Bible that talks about, like you really got to be careful what you say, because a bird will take what you say and fly away with it, and, kind of this idea of your words will be exposed, and used against you. And, and we know obviously that why this is happening is that God wants to bring judgment against President Trump because of this peace deal, because of how he has treated Israel. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so I also wanted to, talk more about the three commissioners in this story. And so what we're seeing right now is that there's two Benjamins in Israel that are currently, trying to get the prime minister position. And so that's Benjamin Netanyahu and then Benny Gantz. He goes by Benny, not Benjamin. And so what I think is kind of interesting is that in this story, we're talking about three commissioners, of who Daniel was one. Okay, so Daniel is a messianic figure, which he is, definitely a lot of times in the, scriptures. Then, the third Benjamin, well, here, let me share these verses from Genesis, and they would help us clear up who the third Benjamin is. So this is in Genesis 35, and it says, Then they, and this would be Jacob and his family, journeyed from Bethel, and when there was still some distance to go to Ephreth, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. When she was in severe labor, the midwife said to her, Do not fear, for now you have another son. It came about as her soul was departing, for she died, that she named him Ben-Oni, the son of my sorrow. But his father called him Benjamin, the son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Jacob set up a pillar over her grave. That is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. So what's interesting is they're going to this town Ephrath, which is, I guess, another name for Bethlehem. And we know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So it's kind of interesting. It's like there's a bit of a distance to go until Jesus is born in Bethlehem. So while this is happening, Rachel began to give birth and she suffered severe labor. Well, we know we've been in the birth pangs for quite a while now. And so I emphasize severe labor. I don't like that word because it means it's going to be hard. It's going to be rough. Okay, so what was interesting is when she was in severe labor. And so it's kind of interesting because that could be a picture of like the end of the birth pangs, like really near the birth. The midwife says to her, "Do not fear, for now you have another son." So it's kind of interesting because like when she says, "Now you have another son," that could be an interesting shadow of the fact that, okay, now you have two Benjamins in Israel wanting to be the prime minister. So that's kind of interesting. And then what's interesting too is that it came about as her soul was departing, for she died, that she named him Ben-Oni, the son of my sorrow. So what's interesting is that, right here, like sometimes I think Rachel is a picture of, the Christian church. And then what's interesting here is that maybe she could be a picture of Israel, or the, the nation of Israel right now. That, it talks about, for she died, it talks about her dying. And so we know that before the Messiah comes, I believe that, Israel is going to, we're going to see an attack on Israel before the Messiah comes. And so what's interesting is that she calls her baby Ben-Oni, the son of my sorrow. And so I think this name here, the son of my sorrow, could be a picture of Benjamin Netanyahu, because Benjamin Netanyahu has contributed to Israel's enemies being just more and more angry at Israel. I mean, so Benjamin Netanyahu has done stuff to make the situation in Israel even more precarious, more dangerous for the nation of Israel. And so, and then if you look at maybe from God's perspective, that Benjamin Netanyahu could be the son of God's sorrow, where, he's just not doing things to make God happy. And then also too, this concept of sorrow, relates to, I talk about this in another story, in another video, where it relates to Rachel weeping for her children. This concept of sorrow. But what's interesting is, so it's almost like we have two Benjamins here. We have one that's connected to the sorrow, and then one that's called the son of my right hand. And so that name, Benjamin, is connected to the Messiah, because, it talks about the Messiah being at the right hand of God. So very interesting. So then what happens is that Rachel dies. So who is the third Benjamin? Messiah, yay. So that's what we want to be looking for. That could be what God's trying to say, is that we have the two Benjamins in Israel, and what we're waiting for is the third Benjamin. And so we know the number 3 is definitely connected a lot to Jesus. He rose on the third day. So, definitely, let's be looking for the Messiah to show up. Okay. And then there's this other story I wanted to talk about, which is a little bit more obscure, and it doesn't have a more, it doesn't have a really an election, but it's kind of interesting, so we'll talk about it. And so this story is about this is in 2 Kings, where we have Elisha and the Shunammite woman, and then it's talking about her son. Okay. And so if you know the story, Elisha comes to this woman and he helps her, she's barren, and he helps her helps her have a son. And then so what happens is, okay, so let me read this to you. When the child was grown, the day came that he went out to his father to the reapers. He said to his father, my head, my head. And he said to his servant, carry him to his mother. When he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her lap until noon and then died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. So she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. I didn't include the whole story in here, so definitely you can pull out your Bible and read the whole story. When the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi his servant, behold, there is the Shunammite. When she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught hold of his feet, and Gehazi came near to push her away. But the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is troubled within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Then she said, did I ask for a son for my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? And so then there's, I put in their weird resurrection story, because there is kind of this weird resurrection story where Elijah lays on the child and, puts his hands on the child's hands, and his head on the child's head. And then he, and then the child gets resurrected. And then he calls Gehazi and says, call the Shunammite. So he called her, and when she came into him, he said, take up your son. So what's interesting is that if you know Hebrew, my head, the actual Hebrew words are Rosh. So what I think is kind of interesting, so if we think of this child as being maybe a picture of Israel, it's a boy child, and so what happens with this child is that he gets sick, and that's why he says, my head, he has a problem with his head, and and he ends up dying, and he ends up dying on his mother's lap. And so it's kind of interesting that he says, my head, like he says it twice, and so that could be a connection to the two Benjamins in Israel, that it's like, well, now we have two leaders, or it also, it could be a connection to where we have the leader in Israel is having problems, Netanyahu, and then the leader in America is having problems because they want to, impeach him. So we see that, so what we see in this story is that, the child dies, but then Elisha comes and resurrects this child, and, so definitely a picture of Israel. I told you that, I believe that we're going to see Israel attacked and people killed in the city of Jerusalem. And then the Messiah is going to come and resurrect these people. So what's interesting too is that, so this holiday that's coming up is Rosh Hashanah, and it means head of the year. That's the literal translation of Rosh Hashanah. And so let's talk about this holiday that's coming up that starts today is Rosh Hashanah Eve when I'm making this video. So what's interesting, okay, so let's talk about this holiday. So today's the Eve, tomorrow's Rosh Hashanah. You know how the Jewish holidays always start the evening before, and then tomorrow is the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and then October 1st is the second day. And then on October 2nd, it's kind of interesting because you could almost call it like the third day of Rosh Hashanah. It's Tishri 3, the third day of the Hebrew month of Tishri. But what else happens on October 2nd? It's the fast of Gedalia. And so, let's see. Okay, so what's interesting is that September 30th is the start of the year 5780 on the Hebrew calendar. So tomorrow is the start of the new year. So we're going to be going from 5779 to 5780. Well, starting tonight into tomorrow. And in the article, the rabbis call this the year of corrections. Well, it's interesting that they call it the year of corrections because I talk a lot about the concept of the reversal of fortune in Joseph's story. So Joseph, in Genesis, the Joseph in Genesis, he goes from, being in prison to being a leader, being a very powerful leader. And so we see in his story a reversal of fortunes. We see in the book of Job the reversal of his fortunes from being the suffering Job to, getting, his riches back, where we see God making up for the years that the locusts have eaten in Job's life. And then what also connects to this is that what we see in Egypt is the judgment of the firstborn. And so if you understand that right now God has allowed the Egyptian firstborn to have power, so basically like the people that don't follow God right now in the world are in power. If you understand that, and if you understand that, one of the things that God is going to do is he's going to bring judgment on the firstborn, and he's going to bring down the firstborn, in the last, the last plague before the second greater Exodus. And so what's interesting is that I have been seeing in the news, like all over the place, this concept of airplanes falling out of the sky. They're not necessarily crashing, but there are some crashing, and it just seems like almost every other day there's another airplane story of, a crash or, problems with landing or, whatever it is. And so we saw that on September 18th. We saw Delta Flight 2353 descended 30,000 feet in 8 minutes. Okay, so what's interesting to me is that this is I picked this particular plane, plane story because there's just some really interesting pictures in this plane. And so what's interesting, it was a Delta flight. So if you understand that Delta means a difference or a change in something, would be like the literal translation from the Greek. So we see that picture of there's going to be a change happening, and so when the picture of the airplanes, they're up in the sky, they have, they're a picture of the leaders, and then they are going to descend. They're going to lose their leadership. They're going to lose their power. So it was interesting that this happened on September 18th, where I talk about the 666. What's interesting, it was Delta Flight 2353. So 23, I've seen the number 23 connected to President Obama, but what's interesting, it's 2353, and so 53 could definitely be connected to the Messiah. We got 5 is the number of Messiah. We got 3 connected to the Messiah. The Delta flight descends 30,000 feet. And so we see that number 3, we got that number 8. And so 3 and 8 are both connected to the Messiah, but we also see 8 connected to the Antichrist, to Obama, because he was the 6th king, and then he's going to become the 8th king. So definitely some interesting connections there. What's also interesting is the Delta is the 4th letter in the Greek alphabet, and so I've talked about the 4 winds being connected to Obama coming back into power, so him and three other people. Hillary Clinton is probably one of them. Maybe John Kerry, not sure who the other two are. Okay, um, so pay attention to the airplanes because it's just kind of interesting. Okay, so then what happens on Rosh Hashanah? So back to this Rosh Hashanah holiday. There is a sounding of the ram's horn on both mornings. Okay, so what's interesting is that the horn is not blown on today. The horn has been blowing the whole month of where are we? The whole month of Elul. Let's see. They have a daily sounding of the shofar during the month of Elul. The month of Elul is considered the month of divine mercy and forgiveness, according to the rabbis. Um, um, but what's interesting is they take a break today. They don't blow the horn today. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then the Rosh Hashanah is considered a Shabbat-like holiday, like a Sabbath. They rest on it. They don't work. And then, so what's interesting in the article that I read to you, when they predicted that the Messiah will show up on the Sabbath after the election, it could mean the next festival in Israel, not necessarily the next, and because we already know, the election was on the 17th. There's already been two Sabbaths since the 17th, so it's not going to be an actual, Sabbath, but it could be a holiday that's also considered like a Sabbath. But also a possibility is that the Messiah is going to be so the whole Sabbath picture is a whole picture of the Messiah of the Messianic kingdom. And so because the Messiah is going to bring us rest. So when you say the Messiah is going to show up on a Sabbath, he is the Sabbath. He's bringing us Sabbath, and so even if it doesn't happen during the Rosh Hashanah, we still have a Sabbath to come. And there's a whole teaching of that in Hebrews, of you don't want to miss the rest, that the Messiah brings. Okay, and then so Rosh Hashanah is considered the birthday of the universe. And then I'm reading this stuff that I got off of Chabad.org website. And then it says, as we read in the Rosh Hashanah prayers each year on this day, all inhabitants of the world pass before God like a flock of sheep. Now, isn't that interesting? It kind of connects back to that phrase in the scriptures in Luke, where there was a census of all the inhabited world. So to me, it's always fascinating when we see the rabbis using phrases that we find in the New Testament, but just kind of interesting. And so each year on this day, all inhabitants of the world pass before God like a flock of sheep, and it is decreed in the heavenly court who shall live and who shall die, who shall be impoverished and who shall be enriched, who shall fall and who shall rise. Does that not sound like the census we read about in Luke that I talked about? Definitely very interesting. And then it's, and so this census happened before Messiah came, before Jesus was born. So definitely some really interesting connections. Okay, so the Torah refers to this day as Yom Teruah, which is the day of shofar blowing. And we're all kind of looking for, there's that verse in the New Testament that talks about the last trump, being connected to the coming of the Messiah. So we're definitely, Rosh Hashanah is definitely interesting, that it's a day that the shofar is blown. And then so Chabad.org says, in our prayers, we often call it Yom HaSikoron, Day of Remembrance, and Yom Hadin, Day of Judgment, since this is the day when God recalls all of his creations and determines their fate for the year ahead. Wow. Kind of interesting. I thought it was kind of interesting that it's called the Day of Remembrance, because if Israel actually does get invaded during Rosh Hashanah, we're going to be reminded of the Holocaust. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And we see that in Revelation, the souls under the altar, which I think is the picture of the souls from the Holocaust, waiting for, God to, bring, bring about, I forget that word, what it's called. They're waiting for, the finishing up of, we haven't seen God kind of finish up things connected to the Holocaust. Okay, and so then to continue reading, together with Yom Kippur, which follows 10 days later, it is part of the Yamin Norim, days of awe, or high holidays. Okay, so it's considered a high holiday. And so a lot of the Jewish people that that wouldn't go to the synagogue any other day would definitely show up on Rosh Hashanah and show up on Yom Kippur. Okay, and so let's talk about the shofar blowing. It contains a series of 3 types of blasts: tekiah, a long sob-like blast; shevarim, a series of 3 short wails; and teruah, at least 9 piercing staccato blasts. So they actually end up blowing the shofar. I mean, I think it's like at least 100 times on Rosh Hashanah, throughout the course of the day. So it's a lot of shofar blowing. And then the blowing of the shofar represents the trumpet blast that it sounded at a king's coronation. Its plaintive cry also serves as a call to repentance. Very powerful stuff. The king's coronation, that's a picture of, the Messiah's coronation. The shofar itself recalls the binding of Isaac, an event that occurred on Rosh Hashanah in which a ram took Isaac's place as an offering to God. Okay, so that whole story, the binding of Isaac, that is the story where God calls Abraham to go sacrifice Isaac on the mountain. Definitely a very interesting prophetic picture of what's going to happen to Israel, that Israel's going to be sacrificed, but there's resurrection in that story because Isaac and Abraham come back down from the mountain. So very interesting. And then the ram gets sacrificed in Isaac's place. And so if you understand the connection of the ram to like America and President Trump, you see that, okay, first Israel gets judged and then America and President Trump gets judged. So definitely a very powerful story. It's definitely very interesting that that's connected to Rosh Hashanah. Okay, and so then on Rosh Hashanah, they greet each other. And on the first night of Rosh Hashanah, you're supposed to wish a male, Lashana Tova Tikata Vetikatam. For a female, you say, Lashana Tova Tikatevi Vitikatami. Okay, and what they mean is, may you be inscribed and sealed for a good year. At other times, during the holiday, or after the holiday, you wish them a Gemar Katima Tova, a good inscription and sealing in the book of life. And so there's this, you have this sealing concept, and we see in the book of Revelation the sealing of the 144,000. So the Messiah is going to come and he's going to seal his people. We see the story of the Passover lamb, is a picture of like a seal on the door, so when death comes they don't die. So that's definitely a messianic picture of how he's going to seal us. We are not going to suffer the judgments and the wrath. I believe we're still going to be here on earth, but we're going to be sealed. We're going to be like in our house covered by the Lamb. We're going to be protected when all these judgments come. Okay, and so then Tashlik, let me tell you about this. On the first afternoon of Rosh Hashanah, it is customary to go to a body of water, ocean, river, pond, etc., and perform the Tashlik ceremony, in which we ceremonially cast our sins into the water. With this tradition, we are symbolically evoking the verse, and you shall cast their sins into the depth of the sea. So I thought it was interesting, this tradition they have of Tashlik that they do, because what's interesting is that in wait, what happened here? Okay, yeah. So in Genesis 8, we read, now it came about in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month, the water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground was dried up. And then in Revelation 16:12, we also see another verse that talks about water drying up. And it says, the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and his water was dried up so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. Okay, so if you understand that during the time of Noah, when he was 600 years old, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And so there's this picture of the flood rising during the time of Noah, of the water, coming and covering the mountains. And so if you understand that the rain and water is a picture of like the lies, it's a picture of lies, okay? And so what we have in Revelation 12 is that we have the beast pours, a river of water toward the woman, but the earth swallows up the river that he sends out. And so what's happening is that we see the beast is trying to lie to the woman, but the river gets swallowed up. And so one of the things that would be helpful to understand is that during the time of, this is during the time of President Trump, is that this rain is continuing to flood the earth. And so these lies, okay, so we have two sets of lies happening, is that we have the lies about the Antichrist are growing during the time of President Trump. And then we have the lies about President Trump that are growing. And so it talks about rain for 40 days and 40 nights. So 40 is the picture of birth. Okay, 40 weeks is the time of a pregnancy. And then it's interesting that it rains for 40 days and 40 nights because the night is definitely connected to the Antichrist. So we see a birthing of the Antichrist kingdom during the time of, President Trump's time in office. And then the 40 days could be, I see two different possibilities for the 40 days. The 40 days could be a picture of the birthing of the Messiah, but also we could see a birthing of, President Trump being seen as like a Messiah for Israel, and he's a false Messiah, and he's people have called him the King of Israel. Someone called him that. He retweeted that. So people are being beguiled by President Trump, to think that he's like a Messiah, so that can be connected to the 40 days, where the day is, connected to the Messiah. And so anyways, what's interesting is in Ecclesiastes 11, which is kind of an interesting, weird book, we have this verse where it says, cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. And so I thought that was interesting because if you understand that the bread is the picture of the Jewish people because they are the body of Christ, um, it talks about cast your bread on the surface of the waters. And so this rain that has fallen for 40 days and 40 nights has caused all these lies to grow. It has caused the Antichrist kingdom to grow. And so the bread, God's people in Israel are going to be cast onto the surface of the waters. But what's interesting is in this verse we see the promise of resurrection, for you will find it after many days. And then what I think is kind of interesting too is that, so I'm going to go back to this screen where it says, let's see, so on Tashlik, they are ceremonially casting their sins into the water. They actually throw pieces of bread into a body of water, which is just fascinating that they do that. And that happens on the first afternoon of Rosh Hashanah. So I thought that was kind of interesting because I kind of see that what's going to happen is that when Israel gets invaded, the lies connected to President Trump are going to be revealed. All of a sudden, people are going to recognize, definitely God's people are going to recognize that President Trump is not the Messiah because, he did not bring peace to Israel. He brought war to Israel. And so I thought it was kind of interesting is that they ceremonially cast their sins into the water. I see kind of a picture of like the scapegoat where the sins are put onto the scapegoat, and then the scapegoat is that happens on Yom Kippur. It's a ceremony for Yom Kippur, where then the scapegoat is sent into the wilderness. So definitely some very interesting connections. And that text that I was getting, my sister is wishing me a happy holiday for Rosh Hashanah. So that was nice. Okay, so then let's talk about, so the rabbis in the article, they talk about war, they talk about war in heaven. Let's see, I don't remember their exact phrase that they used, but we see the concept of what they talk about is like a war in heaven, and they talk about, the evil fighting against, God's people. And so I wanted to talk about these verses in Revelation where we, read about the war in heaven. Okay, so this is in Revelation 12. Because, I wanted to read these because definitely the rabbis are predicting that that's going to happen on Rosh Hashanah Eve. And so, okay, so let's read about this. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down. He who accuses them before our God day and night. Okay. So I talk about the war in heaven in my fiery trial video. We go over some verses in there. But let's talk about these verses in Revelation. And so what I thought was interesting is that I had mentioned before that I think we can see multiple fulfillments for prophecy. I mean, that God has made his word so rich that I think sometimes he could be talking about three events in a couple of verses, three different events that happen. The way he words stuff, he could be prophesying about three different things. And that's what I think is happening in these verses with the war on heaven, is that I see three possible fulfillments. And so if you read about these, like the Donald Trump election, so if you read these, that if you have Michael and his angels being President Trump and his followers waging war with the dragon being Obama, and his angels, which, of course, Hillary would be one of his angels. So let's read this. It says, and there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war on the dragon. So President Trump waging war with Obama and Hillary. And the dragon and his angels waged war. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. Hillary, she did not win. She didn't have enough votes. It wasn't strong enough for her to win. The opposition to Trump wasn't strong enough, and so they didn't win. And so then the great dragon was thrown down. The serpent of old, who was called the devil and Satan, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So they lost power. I mean, this is, really true, that they lost a lot of the power that they had during Obama's presidency, and they were thrown down to the earth, which I think is the wound that we see on the dragon. Okay, the fatal wound. Okay, so that's one fulfillment. But let's read about this being Israel. Okay, let's look at these verses again, being connected to Israel and Iran. Okay, so what's interesting is that we see the woman, she's about to give birth, and let's see, she's in the wilderness for 1,260 days, which is 1260. And so we see kind of a shadow in this 1260 of the 666, because 12, is 66, and then you got 60. And so it's like after the 6 days of 666, there's going to be war in heaven. Okay, so Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. And so, so this time Michael could be President Netanyahu, and his angels, that would be the people in Israel waging war with the dragon. So the dragon and his angels wage wars. So what we see in Daniel, where it talks about the people of the prince who is to come. And so it's not that necessarily that, Obama's going to be fighting with Israel, but we definitely see Iran and, its proxies waging war. And so, right here, the dragon could be Iran, but still a connection to Obama, let me tell you. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. Well, so what's interesting is, so God uses the word they, and so, when people are talking and they use the word they, sometimes it's not clear who they're talking about. And so what's interesting is, like, this word they, God uses kind of, he doesn't explicitly say who wasn't strong enough. So each time this prophecy is being fulfilled, it's a different different group that's not strong enough. And so when it says they were not strong enough, who wasn't strong enough? It's going to be Israel, because they're going to be overtaken. They were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. So we're definitely going to see problems in Israel. so if you see Israel as being heaven, definitely interesting. So then the third fulfillment, which is the final fulfillment of these verses, would be, when there was war with heaven, Michael and his angels. So this time Michael would be the Messiah, would be Jesus, waging war with the dragon, definitely with Obama. And they're going to wage war back, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer. Now this time they is referring to the dragon and the angels not being strong enough, and they were thrown down. And his angels were thrown down with him. It talks about the Antichrist being thrown into the abyss. So powerful, powerful, powerful verses. And so it was fascinating that the rabbis, kind of what they were saying sounded like war in heaven. It reminded me of these verses. And so here's some other verses in the New Testament connected to this. Luke 21:20-22, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city. It's kind of interesting. You got three groups of people right there, could be connected to the three woes, because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. And then in Luke 21, it says, but when you see these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift your heads. And interesting, we're seeing heads all over the place because your redemption is drawing near. Very interesting that he uses heads, lift up your heads. So could be a connection to Rosh Hashanah. I don't know. We'll see. And then Matthew 24, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So one of the things I wanted to mention, because this is very important, is that earlier in this month, so on September 10th, so when Netanyahu was, getting ready for the elections, 1 week before the elections on September 10th, he talked about he was going to annex 1/3 of the West Bank if he was elected. And so what's interesting, if you understand, if you remember that President Trump talked about the Golan, that he was going to recognize the Golan, and, Netanyahu actually came to Washington and they signed papers connected to the Golan. And the problem with the Golan announcement is that all it really accomplished was it gets Israel's enemies even madder. Okay, well, so really a dumb move on President Trump's part. And then so what's even dumber is that then we have Netanyahu doing very similar things by saying he was going to annex 1/3 of the West Bank. It's like, what are these people thinking? And so I'm seeing, that we could see what Netanyahu did as part of this abomination of desolation, standing in the holy place. We have President Trump and Netanyahu making decisions connected to Israel, where if you see Israel as the holy place, then we see, what's going to happen is, that Jerusalem's desolation is near, because they're going to end up, you reap what you sow, and they made bad decisions about Israel, and now they're going to reap it. And, so anyways, so we've seen that, this abomination of desolation. If you understand that what they did were abominations because it made things worse for Israel. Okay, so then going on, so in Mark, it says, even so, too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. So, let's see. So I wanted to move into the concept where the rabbis talked about the Messiah being at the door. And so we actually see verses in the New Testament talking about Messiah being at the door. And so I read you the verse in Mark, and then in Revelation 3:20 we said, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me." And then in Revelation 4 it says, "And after these things I looked, and behold, the door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I had heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things.'" Okay, so we see the door open in heaven, and then we see the sound of a trumpet. So we see a Rosh Hashanah connection in this verse to the door. Okay, so then I wanted to read in 1 Thessalonians. It says, "For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape." Okay, thief in the night. Okay. So I wanted to say, so it's not that I'm thinking it's not that Jesus is the thief in the night, but that his day is going to come just like the thief in the night. Okay, so a thief in the night comes suddenly, right? But I think what we're going to see is that the day of the Lord, that Jesus is going to come after this thief comes in the night. And so I think what we're going to see is the thief in the night is going to be Iran and Israel's enemies. They're going to come suddenly, and then the Messiah is going to follow suddenly after that. So the Messiah comes sometime. He either comes the same time as the thief in the night or soon after. I'm leaning towards soon after. Because maybe like 2 days later. Because Jesus stays 2 days in his place after Lazarus gets sick. Okay, so there's lots of people, so it's kind of interesting because lots of people in September, at the end of September, we're talking about peace and safety. So I listed these. On September 19th, Greenblatt went to Israel and he was talking with Netanyahu about Trump's peace plan, and then that was on the 20th, and then he was talking to Gantz on the 23rd about the peace plan. And then on September 21st was the UN. They had their International Day of Peace. And then on September 25th, was kind of interesting is that Iran, Rouhani from Iran, he was talking about, so weird. He was talking about he has this thing called HOPE, which is the Hormuz peace endeavor. And so that's his Gulf peace plan, and it started with the troops leaving. You know how the United States is sending some troops into Saudi Arabia and stuff out there to help with Iran, so that was Rouhani's peace plan. Definitely kind of interesting. And one of the things, and there was also the Houthi rebels, they also on September 20th, they also offered a proposal to halt attacks on Saudi Arabia. So what's interesting is if you recognize in the Bible, it talks about, like, this is in the Psalms, it says, they talk peace, but there's war in their heart, and so we got Rouhani. Do you think he really wants a peace endeavor? This guy has war in his heart big time. Death to Israel, death to America is what he says all the time. What they say in Iran. And so he does not want peace. So you got to recognize that even though they can talk peace, they have war in their heart. Definitely the Houthi rebels, have war in their heart. And so I wanted to talk about the 70th week. Let's see. So other people have the 70th week. They have it being a time frame of 7 years. Like the 7-year tribulation, period that we hear about. But I wanted to mention. So in the Joseph story, he prophesied about 7 years of abundance in Egypt and 7 years followed by 7 years of famine. Then that comes out of Pharaoh's dreams. So what I thought was interesting is that if you recognize that the 7 years of abundance is 7 years of abundance in Egypt, then what you're going to see is that there was, okay, so what I think the 7 years is connected to the 7 years of Obama, because that was, God allowed Egypt, he allowed kind of the Antichrist and his followers to grow in power for 7 years. And that's what we saw during the time of Obama. They got even more powerful during the time of Obama's presidency. And then what is interesting is that in the Joseph story, he divides the 7 years of famine into 2 years and 5 years. Okay, so when his brothers go to see him, Joseph says, okay, so we've had 2 years of famine and there's still 5 years of famine to come. So, so I'd like to propose that the 2 years is the 2 years of the time of Trump. It's, probably going to end up being 2 years and 9 months. But it's, the 2 years are connected to Trump. And then, and especially when you see like the twos connected to, to the two things that he did that brings trouble to Israel. And then the 5 years of famine. So remember that the 5 years of famine, it's going to be famine in Egypt. Okay. And so I'd like to propose that the 5 years is connected to the time of Messiah. That was when Joseph was revealed. And 5 is a number connected to the Messiah. It's connected to Judah. And so when the Messiah comes, there's going to be, he's going to bring famine to Egypt. He's going to bring down, God's enemies, during his time. But I think he comes first for 7 days, puts a seal on his people, and then he goes away. And then I think there's 30 days or 45 days of the Antichrist where he allows him to just, go to town, and that he uses the Antichrist to bring judgment on America and Trump. And then the Messiah will come back and deal with the Antichrist. Okay, so dates. Okay, so, I don't like to talk about dates because I'm not really good at it, so if you want to skip this part of the video, I totally understand. But because the rabbis mentioned Israel being invaded on Rosh Hashanah Eve, it just got me looking at these dates to see if, if there's a connection. Do they fit into the scriptures? One of the things we need to understand about, okay, so the rabbis say that Israel is invaded on Rosh Hashanah Eve. So one of the things that you need to recognize, see, this could be why no one knows the day or the hour, is that you need to ask yourself, is that Israeli time or is that American time? My husband's always asking me this when I bring up stuff, and I'm like, oh yeah, good point. Because, is it going to be Rosh Hashanah Eve in Israel, or is it going to be Rosh Hashanah Eve in America? Well, so what I kind of am wondering is that since we are wrapping up the time of the Gentiles, and so what's going to happen is God's going to use this invasion of Israel to get his people's attention. It's interesting that the rapture theory, it talks about God turning his attention back to the Jewish people. I don't think he ever took his attention off the Jewish people, but the Gentiles, the Christian church needs to turn their attention to the Jewish people. And so I think that's what's going to happen with this invasion. It's that it's tearing down the wall between Jew and Gentile. And so then I talked about, and the thing is that, okay, so what happens on Rosh Hashanah, Eve, if that's when things actually happen? I mean, it's not really clear to me totally what's going to happen. Does Israel get invaded? I don't know if it's going to be a war of bombs. And so maybe we don't see literal armies in Israel. We just, it's interesting when you talk about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. we already see that Iran sort of has its proxies in the various states, countries around Israel, so you could kind of say it's already surrounded by its enemies. You know, um, so that could already be fulfilled. And so we don't know if Israel's going to be invaded first and then the bombs are going to come, like if Jerusalem's going to be bombed after that. I'm not really sure. And so when we see that Jesus says, okay, so I mentioned this before, Jesus stays 2 days longer when he hears that, he stays 2 days longer where he is when he hears that Lazarus is sick. Okay, so with the 2 days, you don't know if that means 2 literal days. Does it mean, it could be a reference to 2 weeks. Okay, so let's say Lazarus being sick was the elections in Israel. So 2 weeks after the Israeli election would be around October 1st or October 2nd. 2 days after Rosh Hashanah Eve would be October 1st. But then you don't know. I mean, is it an invasion in Israel and then they get bombed and then it's 2 days after they get bombed? I'm not really sure. Okay, and then what's interesting too is that in Genesis 8:5, it says the water decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the top of the mountains became visible. And so I thought that was interesting because, this is always what's interesting. You don't know if God's talking about Jewish dates or Gregorian dates. He is working with the Gentiles, so we might see some of the dates might actually refer to Gregorian dates. And so then that would be October 1st. Would be the 10th day, the first month, where the mountains become visible. And that could be a fulfillment of, so we see the woman, we see a sign in heaven where the woman is has a crown of 12 stars, and is clothed with the sun. And so what we could be seeing is that on October 1st we're seeing the woman is definitely now the 7 mountains are visible because they are looking toward Zion. They're asking the way to Zion, So that would be October 1st. And then October 2nd, what's interesting about that date, it's the 3rd day of the month, the 8th day of creation, the way the rabbis calculated. So it's a 3rd day and an 8th day. So that's always interesting to me because those are definitely 2 numbers connected to the Messiah. It's the 24th day after 9919. And so on 9919 was when, I don't know if it was an article or if Netanyahu made a comment, but I wrote on my calendar that Israel was facing multi-front hostilities on that day. I don't know if that was a news article. So it was interesting that was said on 9919. And then it was interesting because the next day on 9/10 was when, Netanyahu, made his announcement about, annexing the West Bank. And so then if you count 24 days after 9/9, you get to October 2nd. And so why 24 is interesting to me is that you have Daniel is mourning and fasting for 3 weeks. And then on the 24th day, he has a messianic encounter. And so definitely would be interesting to see if something happens on this 24th day. You never know where to start counting. Where's the, where do you start counting for the 21st day and the 24th day? But you would see a 21st day and a 24th day here because 21 would end up on Rosh Hashanah Eve, and then 24 would end up on October 2nd. So definitely kind of interesting if you start counting from 9/9. But like I said, you don't know when to start counting. And then what's interesting is that Wednesday, October 2nd, is the fast of Gedalia. And so we see a promise from God that he's going to take our fasts and turn them, or the Jewish fast days, and turn them into days of joy. So, so kind of interesting. And then October 2nd is interesting too because it's 40 weeks plus 1 day after Christmas. So what was interesting was Christmas was the 777th day after we voted in Trump. So maybe that would be considered like the start of the 9-month pregnancy, the 40-week pregnancy. And then what's interesting, so then if you have 7 days from October 2nd to October 8th, October 8th would be Yom Kippur Eve, and then Yom Kippur is October 9th. I'm wondering if Yom Kippur is the birth of the Antichrist, and maybe that's why God had the Jewish people praying and fasting on that day. I don't know, because what's interesting is that President Obama has done, there's quite a few things kind of happened on Yom Kippur throughout the years connected to President Obama, like especially he met with, on September 23rd, I think it was 2015, he met with the Pope on that day. So while the Jewish people are, praying for, praying and fasting, Obama and the Pope are meeting. So very interesting, just kind of an interesting theory. Okay, so October 9th. So on Yom Kippur, that would be 40 weeks plus 1 day after January 1st, 2019. So January 1st was the 2-year anniversary after Trump made his Make America Great Again, like New Year's vow on January 1st, 2017. So thought that was kind of interesting. And then, okay, so like I said, Obama met with the Pope on Yom Kippur 4 years ago. But then, okay, what if, we were past these dates and nothing happened? Well, don't give up hope. Sukkot, or, the Feast of Tabernacles, is October 14th to the 20th. Definitely lots of connections to the Messiah. The thing is, I don't really know if, Jesus is coming back on a fast day, or a feast day, I should say. Well, I said fast day or a feast day, or if he, we just don't know for sure. We just have to wait and see what happens. And I am really terrible at knowing dates. And it actually kind of turns out that, we have these high watch dates, and they do end up being, something happens, I was watching the 70 years and 70 weeks, and really what happened was the election that didn't work out, which was interesting because 70 weeks after President Trump made his declaration on December 6, 2017, was when the first Israeli election that didn't work out. Okay, so then I wanted to talk about the 9/11 connections. I was done talking about that. Okay, so the Israeli elections, so what was really interesting is that the Israeli elections were exactly in the middle of the two 9/11 dates. And so we have 9/11 on the Gregorian calendar, and then we had 9/11 on the Hebrew calendar, which was actually September 23rd, which was interesting because that was 4 years after Obama had met with the Pope. And so then, and also September 23rd was the 18th anniversary of 9/11. And so we see that number 18 in, there was 18 who died. Okay, in Luke, Jesus talks about the 18 who died when the tower fell on them. And then there was a woman sick for 18 years, bent over for 18 years. So definitely kind of interesting. And also the 18 comes from, there was a World Series of baseball that there was 18 innings. And so I thought that was an interesting connection. And so I think that was a couple years ago, and, it could be, people were looking at the 70th year and God was trying to say, no, 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 it's 18 years after 9/11. So I'm not really sure the exact timing, but maybe that's what God was saying. And okay, so then I wanted to talk about the 9/11 picture because, I mean, God definitely painted this picture in 9/11. And so what we see is, first we see the airplanes crashing into the buildings. And so if we see the airplanes as pictures of the leaders, we could see like the airplanes crashing. So we could see like this picture of the leaders bringing down these buildings or these nations. And so the two leaders I'm looking at are Trump and Netanyahu. Okay, so what's interesting is that the South Tower on 9/11 fell first. Okay, so if we know that Israel is the southern kingdom, we see a picture of Israel falling first. Okay, and so that's the first woe. Talked about the woes in my last video. Okay, the North Tower falls second. Okay, and so what I believe is that America is going to fall second, and that's going to be the second woe, and that's actually going to be the time of the Antichrist. So that's judgment on America, on Babylon. And then what was interesting on 9/11 is that you had the World Trade Center number 7 fall. And so the Jewish people talk about like the 70 nations being a picture of the world. And, so we see this number 7, or, kind of connected to the 70 nations. And then we see world in the World Trade Center name of the tower, of the building, I mean. And so that's a picture of, and that happened like, the towers fell in the morning, and then the World Trade Center number 7 fell like in the evening on that day. And so that's a picture of judgment on the world and the Antichrist. And so that's the third woe. Okay, so I think that's everything. So thank you so much for tuning in. So definitely look up because your redemption draws nigh. Definitely, if it doesn't happen on these dates, don't give up hope. Just kind of get more of the picture of maybe the order of events would be helpful, what we're looking for. We've definitely seen a lot of fulfillment of prophecy, and so I definitely think the Messiah is right at the door, just like these rabbis say. So definitely hang in there. God's blessings on you. So definitely hang in there because I think the Messiah is going to come soon and we're going to see a reversal of fortunes. So, if you're sick, the Messiah is going to bring you health. If you're in prison, the Messiah is going to set you free. So hang in there. So definitely thanks for tuning in, and I appreciate you checking out my channel, and God bless.